Just Imagine is a 1930 sci-fi comedy set in the distant future of 1980. In this future, we all have numbers instead of names, the government chooses who you marry, and your food is delivered to you in pill form. A dead man from the 1930s is brought back to life in this 1980, and he and his friends walk around seeing how different life is now. This was the first movie I watched to kick off my 1930 project, where I'm trying to watch 100 movies from that year, and it was a really fun one to start with. It is of course fun to look back at 1980 as the far future and the guesses that they made about it, but it's also just a genuinely enjoyable movie, especially when they unexpectedly end up on Mars and have to fight Martians. And our 1930 Everyman is a lot of fun. It's overall a silly, unique little movie. All Quiet on the Western Front is based on the book of the same name, about a German soldier fighting on the front lines of World War I. We follow him from his early recruitment all the way up until he revisits his home on leave and finds that it's not at all the way he remembers it. The film follows the soldier and his classmates who were all recruited at the same time by their school teacher. While big war battle sequences are not my thing in film, I found myself very moved by the sections in which the soldier goes home and tries to enjoy his leave. He has to deal with people making broad statements about what the people at the front should or shouldn't be doing, as well as having to revisit his old classroom and hear the school teacher say the same bits of rhetoric as he used to, without any additional nuance or understanding behind them. This is overall a very powerful, early anti-war movie, and it holds up really well now. Street of Chance stars William Powell as a successful gambler in the big city. His wife, however, has left him because of his gambling, and he decides to give it all up, only for his younger brother to show up determined to make his own future in gambling. The boy has no idea that his older brother has been making a living gambling. He thinks he's been doing stock exchange of some sort, and so William Powell has no choice now but to try to set him on the right path. The stakes in this are high and simple and clear, and even though the story itself plays out pretty straightforwardly, it's engaging and compelling to watch. It's that familiar one last heist before I retire story, but centered around gambling. And the script does more of the heavy lifting than the actors. William Powell seems so understated that it would be hard to tell when things really are at stake if the script didn't tell you. But overall, the movie works, and it is an interesting watch. Morocco tells the story of a romance between a soldier and a nightclub singer in World War I Morocco. He's a womanizer, and she might just be the woman that gets him to settle down. Gary Cooper and Marlene Dietrich play the main two, and while Dietrich is really relatable in this, Cooper is not. He plays such a wildly unpleasant, quick-to-fight soldier who thinks that it's his job to fix everything, and I'm not really excited to see Dietrich chasing after him as if he's anything worth chasing. On top of that, the story and how it builds is really not very interesting. I'm writing this review a couple days after watching it, and I had to go look up on Wikipedia how it ended because it had so little impact on me that I genuinely couldn't remember. It may be worth the watch if you're a big fan of Dietrich. She does have some really good song and dance numbers, but otherwise, it's probably one that you can skip and not miss anything. What Happened, Brittany Murphy is a documentary looking at the mysterious, unexpected, and sudden death of actress Brittany Murphy back in 2009. Questions surrounded her death, as it seemed to come out of nowhere. It was attributed to anemia and pneumonia, but things got weirder from there. For example, her husband died shortly after of the exact same thing. The documentary looks at all different kinds of fan theories, including poisoning and mold and deliberate medical neglect, but just like in the real world, it's unable to fully draw a conclusion. What it does do, though, is make me interested in going back and watching the filmography of Brittany Murphy. I've seen very little of her work, but the documentary really paints her as somebody who had a lot to give and was taken from us too early. Since this wasn't ever going to be able to solve the mystery the way a true crime documentary wants to, it's nice that they at least gave me an interest in the subject that I didn't have before. So kudos to them on that. The Big Trail turns out to be John Wayne's very first starring role, although I didn't know that when I started watching it. He plays a scout for a group of wagon trains heading across the country to Oregon. There are varying plots going around in all the different wagons, but the main two are the young woman that Wayne's character falls in love with, who won't give him the time of the day, and the three men leading the wagon train who turn out to be murderers and scoundrels. While westerns are very much not my genre, I really enjoyed seeing both a very young John Wayne and a very straightforward story with some really interesting visual effects and cinematography work. The scenes where the wagons are being lowered down the cliffs by ropes or where they have to ford the river really bring home the harrowing nature of the trek that they're all making. The personal drama doesn't do as much for me, but there are some great filmmaking techniques here, and it's probably worth watching if you like the genre to begin with. The Group is a Sidney Lumet film about 8 women who are all in the same graduating class in college. The film follows their lives after graduation, their marriages, their job prospects, their political activism, and the relationships they still keep with each other as part of the same group of college friends. The movie moves along very quickly, in the kind of way that makes sense when you're basically marking time between big events. While it's really interesting to dip in and out of each woman's life, there are so many of them, and so many of them look similar to each other, that I could really only keep track of about half of them. This is the kind of thing that I would love to see remade in the current day, as well as one of those ensemble casts that would benefit from star casting because it would be easier to track who is who. Because this is such an episodic film, much of the narrative doesn't actually emotionally land until the very end. Up until then, everything that happens just feels like another small piece of the puzzle and feels a little inconsequential. But it's still a very interesting movie, and something very different than Lumet ever did again. So I'm really glad I got to see it, and I definitely suggest watching it. Earth is a Soviet Union film from 1930 about a community being pushed to undergo collectivization, where individual farms are integrated into larger collectively owned or state-owned farms. The film captures the varying responses to this, with the younger characters excited about how the new program will help them farm more effectively and efficiently with the help of technology, and their fathers wishing to hold to the old way of things and to keep private ownership of their land. Interestingly enough, this movie was initially praised by the Soviet Union, and then shortly thereafter began to be seen as having a confusing or ambiguous political message, and began to be equally parts praised and lambasted. I think that speaks to the humanness of the story being told, that it's so easy to sympathize with both sets of characters as the story is told. What does make for a more compelling story makes for less clear and less desirable propaganda. This was a movie that was more interesting to me as a historical relic than as a story in and of itself, but I'm very glad I watched it. Finch stars Tom Hanks as our lone protagonist, one of the few remaining survivors after a solar flare and an EMP kill all electronics and make being outside in the sun impossible and deadly. Finch knows that he is dying of radiation poisoning and decides to make a robot to take care of his dog after he has passed on. Together, he, the robot, and the dog make their way toward the West Coast to see the Golden Gate Bridge before Finch dies. This movie is such a strange combination of tones. You have this genuinely disquieting post-apocalyptic story that feels not too terribly distant from the world we're in now, and then we have this fully sentient alive robot that feels more like we're leaning into 1980s children adventure movies. And then on top of that, it's basically a sentimental man traveling with a child story. None of these pieces really fit together nicely for me, especially the last, which usually made me roll my eyes every time the robot said something precocious and wise. There are definitely better Last Man Alive stories and better robot and man stories. The Mirror is a dreamlike, non-linear memory film featuring pieces of a young man's life as a boy and as an adult, living through a war, raising a child, and more. It's directed by Andrei Tarkovsky of Stalker and Solaris fame, and just to be honest, I could not stand either of those movies. Tarkovsky's directing moves at a snail's pace, and his dialogue is nearly always philosophical ponderings more than anything directly related to the characters, which makes it even harder for me to connect to. His style is certainly distinct, and I understand and respect that people like him, but I feel too often that I'd get the exact same effect from reading a philosophy book while occasionally glancing at a photo of the countryside. I keep hoping that one of these days I'll find the Tarkovsky film that clicks for me the way that he does for others, but this one, with its memory play feeling and jumping all over the timeline, is not that one. It is shorter than most of his others, which made it an easier watch for me, so it might be a good entry point into Tarkovsky for newbies, and if you like this one, he's definitely got more that are in similar veins. Little Big League tells the story of Billy Haywood, an 11-year-old boy whose grandfather owns the Minnesota Twins. The two bond over their love of baseball, and when the grandfather dies, he leaves the Twins to his grandson. After some difficulty finding the right manager to help pick up the failing team, Billy decides to quit school and manage the team himself. This is a solid but unremarkable wish fulfillment movie for kids, and while I can't think of a reason I'd want to watch it again, it was quite pleasant to watch the first time. Billy is a pretty realistic kid in terms of his vacillating levels of emotional maturity. He's portrayed as a little bit of a precocious genius when it comes to baseball knowledge, but lots of kids have special knowledge, and most of the film isn't focused on that as much as on the emotional pressure of having to live your life like an adult when you're not emotionally ready for that. The camaraderie between him and the other players is sweet, and the emotional beats of the story are predictable but low-key satisfying, and it ends in probably, I think, the best way it could have. You could definitely do worse for a kid's sports movie. Passing is the story of a light-skinned black woman and a friend from childhood who she runs into years later and discovers is passing as a white woman. They rekindle their close friendship despite the friend's husband being overtly racist and not knowing either woman is black. This is a fascinating movie that has a lot of different layers to it, especially in examining the idea of passing both within a racial orientation context and a sexual orientation context. Tessa Thompson as our protagonist is especially compelling. She brings a quiet desperation to her character's role, as we see that she doesn't really feel content with her place in the world. The choice to shoot the cinematography in black and white obviously has thematic symbolism, but it also adds an artistic, dreamy quality to the story, which is really compelling. I'm not entirely sure that I'm satisfied with the way that it ended, not in the sense that I need a fully resolved ending, but in that I'm not sure I got everything from it that I was supposed to, but it was an interesting ride, and worth watching for the performances, if nothing else. It's also one where I want to read other commentary and learn about what I might have missed. Manon of the Spring is the sequel to the 1983 French film Jean de Florette, in which a hunchback farmer buys a farm only for two locals to deliberately sabotage his water supply, and then after the farmer's untimely death, they buy the property cheaply, unsabotage the water supply, and thrive. This story is set a decade or so later, when one of the two unsavory locals falls in love with the daughter of the original farmer who knows what they did to her father. While I found the first film absolutely devastating, this gave me less to connect to emotionally. In the first movie, we have Jean as our protagonist, and we follow him through the story, and here I think Manon is supposed to fill that role for us, but she's such an internal character that she's harder to connect with, and the antagonists get just as much, if not more, screen time. The ending's satisfying, though, and carries a strong thread of humanity through the whole story. I do suspect I've let too long go between watching the first movie and this one, and I think my reaction to this could be very different if I watched them back to back, so I'll definitely have to make time to do that at some point in the future, and we'll report back then on how that changes things. City Girl is a silent film about a young man who is sent into the big city to sell his parents' wheat crop and returns with a wife. The man's father is pretty sure the wife is just a gold digger and does not warm to her at all, so she not only has to adjust to her new life, she also has to try to prove to her in-laws that she and her new husband really are a good match. This is a really charming movie. The stakes are simple, but it's easy to root for the main couple, and it unfolds in a really natural, compelling way, not really what I would have expected. It's a thoughtful sort of melodrama that is a lot more concerned with the characters and their personalities and the way they react to things than the state of events that happens. The plot itself does happen, but it definitely feels very character-driven. It reminded me a lot of the director F.W. Murnau's earlier film Sunrise, which I found equally charming. If you're a fan of Sunrise, you should definitely check this one out if you haven't seen it. It's a sweet and compelling story that was thoroughly enjoyable to watch. The Last Duel tells the story of two friends in medieval France, one a knight and one a squire, who ultimately grow apart and end up challenging each other to a duel when one's wife accuses the other of rape. The film's gimmick is that it's told 3 times, Rashomon style, following each man and then the wife's version of the story. However, unlike Rashomon, the 3 different tellings don't really add to the story as much as they just rehash what we already know. The film does add some subtle differences in the interpretation of the events between each person, but most of those differences weren't interesting or unique enough to make me interested in watching the same story basically 3 times in a row. I like all the performances in this, however. Between this and Stillwater, Matt Damon is really leaning into the character of ignorant wannabe hero in 2021. I think I would have enjoyed this a bit more if it had cut back and forth between the 3 perspectives throughout, instead of playing them one after another. Because while the movie is fine, it's, again, not good enough for me to want to watch it 3 times in a row, and that's basically what I felt like I did. Easy Rider is a 1969 movie following 2 bikers as they make their way to Mardi Gras with the money they've made from smuggling drugs. Along the way, they meet other people living similar carefree lifestyles, some of which join them on their journey, as well as some people who hate them and think people like them are ruining the country. While I'm not sure I got as much out of the movie as was there for me to get, I thought this was an interesting look at this time period, and some of the ways people were trying to react to the dominant culture versus preserve it. There's not really anybody to root for in this film, per se, as all the characters are either unlikable or keep the audience at arm's length. But the questions it raises about conforming to society versus breaking away are very interesting to consider in light of the story. It's a film I'm glad to have seen, but not necessarily one that I feel an urge to watch again. A lot of the scenes are long and winding, and I'm not sure I'd get any more from them a second time, but I get why people really love and connect to this film. I'm just not one of those people. Min and Bill is set in a coastal town where the titular Bill is a fisherman and the titular Min runs an inn. Over a decade ago, a baby was left in Min's care, and now the baby is a young woman, and local authorities are wondering whether she is in an appropriate place for a young woman to be raised. And to add to all that, the child's mother has returned, and despite not being in any position to give her an appropriate mother-child relationship, she's demanding the girl's return. So despite the title being Min and Bill, the story is clearly not about Bill at all. It made me wonder if this was based on some sort of established set of characters and was a spin-off of some kind. I couldn't find any confirmation of that, but it's got that sense of these are established characters we know and there is no recapping for the audience. As it is, it really didn't work for me. I think we're supposed to be on Min's side as she tries to shield her adopted child from her mother, but all she does with this is cut off communication entirely with the girl, and it's seen as a necessary evil when it just seems overtly cruel. It's just kind of a confusing movie, and I'm not entirely sure who it's supposed to be about or why. Hal King is a musical retelling of Shakespeare's Henry IV and V, set in the African-American jazz scene of the 1950s. Hal is the partying hard son of a man running for political office who then has to take up his father's mantle after his death. The movie is entirely sung through, with primarily an R&B musical style. I went into this blind and was delighted to find that it was not only a musical, but a musical setting of Shakespeare. It's an ambitious and interesting concept, and I wish the execution followed through. The sung dialogue bits in between major songs are so tuneless and repetitive, and many of the actual songs don't offer much more, although there are a couple good ones. The choreography and blocking are decidedly not great, which is surprising since the choreographer has Broadway cred, and weirdly enough, the ensemble scenes simply don't have enough people, and so I'm left trying to assess the actual popularity of Hal's jazz poems or his father's political campaign when their audience is like a dozen people. It's the kind of thing you can get away with in theater, but it's a jarring disconnect set against these more realistic set pieces. I want to love this, but it doesn't make it. Anna Christie is a film adaptation of Eugene O'Neill's play of the same name. It stars Greta Garbo in her first speaking role, which is interesting. The story follows a coal barge worker who gave his daughter up when she was very young to live on a farm with his family so she wouldn't have a life on the sea, which he thought wouldn't be suitable for her. Now she's an adult and she's coming back to see him, but there's darkness in her past that she's afraid to bring up now that she has a chance at happiness in her life. So when I saw this movie, I thought back to when I read the play a couple years ago, and I could have sworn that the play ended completely differently, but no, it turns out I was wrong, and both play and film have a sort of abruptly happy ending. Somehow the tragedy of the story and the box into which this woman finds herself, based on how she's supposed to behave as a woman, it rang so loudly to me that I drowned out the happy ending in my memory. And honestly, I think this is still a tragedy, and a very unsatisfying one. The acting and the scripting in this is good and well-paced and relatable, but I think no matter how the story is told, I'll never be able to reckon with the way that the ending is framed. Encanto is the newest Disney release about a magical family in a remote village in Colombia. We mostly focus on one daughter, Mirabel, the only one in her family to not be gifted a magical superpower. But now she's also the only one who is starting to notice that the magic they've relied on for decades might be fading. This is the third musical released this year, featuring music by Lin-Manuel Miranda, so it's no surprise that the soundtrack is really fantastic. It does just such an excellent job of creating the world through song. But the story is lovely too, with a rich cast of characters, many of whom get their own song and distinct story arc, and a beautiful message about family and acceptance. The magical realism of the story brings with it levels of metaphor that will fly over kids' heads, but had me thinking about them for days. It's one of those special kids movies where it's easily entertaining enough for children, but it also goes a little bit deeper to provide a great story for adults too. Everybody's Talking About Jamie is a filmed version of a recent stage musical. It's about a teenage boy who decides he wants to be a drag queen and has to figure out how he can be authentically himself in a school that doesn't seem too eager to accept him. This musical took the West End by storm and became something of a cult classic, especially among young musical theater lovers. And I get why. It is deeply heartwarming to see Jamie working to find himself, especially when it is well received. And the story does a good job of placing him in the context of LGBTQ+ history. We see where his journey is easier than those who came before him, as well as how it is still a challenge in many ways. The songs in this don't immediately jump out to me as classics, but maybe they just need some more listening. They're certainly performed well by this solid cast. I also like how the film leans into the theatricality of the musical numbers, using them to really convey a feeling more than just deliver expository information. I'm not totally sold on this for myself, but I'm glad to have seen it. And I'm sure there are a lot of people for which this musical will deeply matter to them, and that's really great. The Little Rascals is a 1994 adaptation of the classic series about a group of small boys who have solemnly sworn off women and get into hijinks around their town. In this particular version of the story, the boys are trying to win the go-kart derby, but their chosen racer Alfalfa is falling in love, and so his friends decide to sabotage his new relationship to try to get him focused back on club business. So there's a specific kind of humor centered around watching small children speak like adults. And while I do love seeing how kids naturally pick up adult speech patterns in the process of learning language, I find it not at all entertaining when those lines are scripted by adults to be funny. And that's 90% of this humor. Watching kids repeat lines grown-ups obviously wrote for them. And it just doesn't work for me on any level. It doesn't feel natural, and I have no attachment to these characters, so not even that can win me over. I fully believe there are people this movie is for. It's not trying to be anything other than what it is, but it's certainly not for me. Fatherhood stars Kevin Hart as a man whose wife dies in childbirth, leaving him to raise his daughter alone. His family and friends aren't sure he can do it, but he's determined. The story is split into two sections, one when his child is a newborn and one when she's about 6. I've often said that some of the best dramatic performances can come from comedians, since comedy is already towing the line of tragedy most of the time. And while Hart isn't stellar here, he definitely taps into that fine line here, and delivers a pretty good performance. The script helps. It lets him just be a regular guy with a good sense of humor, lending authenticity to his interactions with his in-laws, his daughter, his friends, his new girlfriend. We've seen this kind of story before, and this one doesn't tread much new ground, except we don't have that many stories featuring black men and their daughters. So even if it's a familiar story in a lot of ways, that alone does add a new layer that's worth telling. If this is your kind of genre, this is a perfectly good addition. Guarding Tess stars Shirley MacLaine as a former First Lady of the US, and Nicolas Cage as the Secret Service agent tasked with keeping her secure. MacLaine is a terrible boss, and Cage would like nothing more than to get away from her, but she's taken a liking to him, and she keeps using her influence with the current president to get him reassigned to her. This movie isn't entirely sure what genre it's trying to be, whether it wants to be a comedy, or a heartwarming drama, or an action thriller, and as a result, it doesn't really stick any of its landings. There's one scene toward the end where Cage is pulling an aggressive thriller Nick Cage kind of move, and I genuinely had no idea if I was supposed to laugh, or be worried about his state of mind, or be like, yeah, get him! MacLaine does a pretty good job bringing some depth to her character and making us care about her right on schedule, but she's rising above the material to get it done. It's okay, it's kind of sweet, it's just also pretty mediocre. Ball of Fire is a screwball comedy written by Billy Wilder and starring Gary Cooper as a bookish professor who, alongside 7 other intellectuals, has been working on writing an encyclopedia for years. In his search to complete the entry on slang, he comes across fast-talking nightclub singer played by Barbara Stanwyck, who is hiding from the law and decides to hide out in the professor's home as part of his study. I've seen the musical film remake of this movie, but somehow never made it to the original, and it's definitely a blast. Stanwyck isn't maybe her best here. She's funny and witty and sharp and always seems to have the upper hand. I've never been a huge fan of Gary Cooper, but his woodenness definitely works in his favor here. And of course, the sample of character actors playing his elderly professor friends are all delightful. The first hour of the film is probably the better. It loses a little bit of its comedic luster when it tries to settle on the romantic drama in the second half, but the casting is still so much fun it totally works. This is definitely one I'm going to return to in the future. Bottle Shock tells the true story of a wine competition in France that invited California wines, which were seen as obviously inferior, to compete alongside French wines in a blind tasting. Alan Rickman plays the man coordinating the whole thing, who is pleased to find some wine of value in the vineyards of Napa and Sonoma, and we see him interacting with one vintner family in particular who are struggling to make ends meet. This is a sweet little underdog story. It often relies too heavily on cheesy sentimentality for me to recommend it to everyone, but the charm of the cast and the good-heartedness of the story are exactly what a lot of people want, and it delivers that. And even though it offers few surprises, if you let yourself lean into rooting for people, it's pretty enjoyable to watch. Particularly Chris Pine, as we see his character step up and actually pursue something he cares about. It's a decent but not stellar watch. I'd pretty much immediately forget it if I didn't live in wine country myself and have a personal connection to this story, but it's alright. Renaissance Man stars Danny DeVito as an ad executive who loses his job and ends up getting an unusual gig teaching in a military academy. He's given a particular group of undereducated recruits and asked to teach them basic comprehension of the English language to raise their competency as soldiers. As they make their way through Shakespeare's Hamlet together, he gets to know them better and tries to figure out how he can support them in their career. So let's be honest, I'm never not going to have a fondness for a movie about how theater can change students' lives. No matter how sappy the movie gets at times, and it does, I love watching people fall in love with plays, whether on screen or in the real-life work I do in my own theater teaching. It does, of course, hit all the tropes of the classic teacher movie and doesn't really expand on or bring much new to the genre, but it handles those tropes competently, and I was happy to go along on the journey. There's more character drama here than there is comedy, so if you're expecting to laugh out loud, you'll be disappointed, but I found it a pretty adequately sweet watch. Anna and the Apocalypse is a Christmas zombie musical, which is an amazing combination. The titular Anna is in her last few days of high school, where she is making big decisions about where to go next, and when a zombie apocalypse breaks out, she, her friends, and her family have to try and survive together. On paper, this is so much fun. Audio only, this is so much fun. But I found myself, to my disappointed surprise, not at all impressed by the visual interpretations of the songs. The horror fight scenes and chase scenes are filmed with so much energy and oomph, and then the songs are performed with this laid-back standoffishness of a too-cool-to-do-anything music video. It kind of feels like a musical made by someone who didn't actually like musicals and wanted to downplay the musical emotion as much as they could visually. The only fun I had was during the principal's villain song. He knew the assignment and ran with it. Maybe too far in the campy direction, but at least I was having a good time. Without the songs, it'd be a fun zombie flick, but with the songs, the pacing is disappointingly uneven. Spencer is a biopic looking at a few days in the life of Princess Diana as she spends Christmas with the royal family. Diana just wants to have a quiet holiday with her boys and is tired and frustrated with her loveless marriage and all the things forbidden to her because of her position, from opening presents on Christmas Day instead of Christmas Eve to keeping her curtains open. The film does an incredible job of showing the stifling atmosphere of this formal holiday gathering and making us feel how Diana is truly at the very edge of her sanity, completely trapped and held back from anything she tries to do to ground herself. Kristen Stewart is stunning here, every moment charged with barely contained, and sometimes not at all contained, fury at the situation she's in. And as she makes impulsive, unpredictable choices to try to regain some agency, it's impossible not to sympathize with her. The cinematography and soundtrack contribute beautifully to the film's suffocating mood as well. Overall, a powerful and compelling glimpse into one person's specific life. Exotica centers most of its action around the strip club named in the title. We follow the owner, the act announcer, one of the dancers, a frequent customer, and a drug smuggler, who doesn't at first seem to be connected to the story. The story unfolds a little at a time, drawing lines between characters and their motivations gradually, until finally we start seeing how everything fits together. The mystery of it all surprisingly doesn't feel as sensationalized as you might assume from the broad strokes of the synopsis. It's almost got the atmosphere of a slice of life story, just one with less traditional centerpieces like drugs and strippers and murder. I found myself genuinely involved with these characters and their concerns and wanting to know how things were going to play out for them. The ending holds on to that understated tone, which again feels odd to say when murder and intrigue are so much a part of the ending, but it ends somehow very gently. It's a unique and interesting movie that kept me engaged the whole time.